Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you for being here today and showing your interest and passion and concern surrounding the connection between public health and the criminal legal system and how using harm reduction approach to these things can create a safe world with less policing. My name is Brandy Fisher, and I am the founder and president of the Alliance for Police Accountability. The Alliance for Police Accountability is a organization that is comprised of over 30 different organizations that have all come together to focus on criminal justice reconstruction. And I'm going to ask my distinguished gifts that I brought to you today, brought you some gifts, to introduce themselves, and we're going to start with Jasiri.
Peace, everybody. My name is Jasiri X. I'm co-founder and CEO of an organization called One Hood Media. Our organization is at the intersection of art, activism, media, education, and power building, community power building. So, yeah, happy to be here. We're also in coalition called the Reimagine Public Safety Coalition with APA and with Alliance for Police Accountability.
Thank you. Jasiri, just briefly, can you tell us what your thoughts are on the language use and idea of defunding the police and how we see certain people echoing by using defund the FBI?
Yeah, I mean, I think people began to look at the budgets, right, particularly here in Pittsburgh, right? We found out that over the last 5 years, our police budget went up by, I believe, $50 to $60 million in 5 years. And so for us and folks that live in our communities, we see the opposite happening, right? We see the resources being put in our community actually going down. Well, not mine. See, it's wild. I live in a community, I call it a formerly black community called East Liberty in Pittsburgh. My community's been totally gentrified. So resources are put in there, but resources are not put in the black community. So black activists all around the country and brown activists as well start to imagine like what our community could do with those resources, right? So the Defund the Police movement was really about like how those resources could benefit and affect our communities, right? We know and we understand that the safest oftentimes the communities that are deemed the safest don't even have a police department in those communities. What they do have is resources, right? It's resources that make a community safe, not the presence of police. And so, but it was interesting as when we started to say defund the police, how it wasn't necessarily Republicans per se, but it was kind of established Democrats that started to say the language is wrong and that's bad language. And like this idea that like we just can't speak the truth in our movements, and then all of a sudden, the FBI want to run up on Mar-a-Lago, and then you have, but conservatives have been doing that. You know what I'm saying? If you look at, conservatives are marching, talking about whose streets, our streets, that's from us. You know what I'm saying? Like, everything but the rioting, y'all keep that. You can claim that. But it is interesting to see how, and a lot of times, at One Hood, we focus on like, actually media narratives is one of the things we focus on. And it's just interesting to see almost very little backlash, like when a white conservative sitting congressperson can say that they defund the FBI, to really very little pushback, even with inside their own party, right? But folks that have actually like been brutalized, beaten, and killed by police for years, for decades, who want some type of reparations from folks that the mere presence of police oftentimes could lead to violence against our community. When we say defund the police, when we say we want police decentered from the lives of black and brown folks, we're too radical to be a part of a movement. It's really ridiculous. And so for all those, so we push back on that. We're going to continue to use the defund language, whether you like it or not, because it's not really about for us whether you can go and run for office and win. For us, it's about our survival as a people and a community, because we are literally being killed by police. We're in the city right here, and I'm going to finish. You got me hyped now. Where a man named Jim Rogers took a bicycle that somebody had on their lawn, the bicycle for sale, I think it was $50. Took the bicycle, rode around the bicycle. They called the police to come because this $50 bicycle was taken from their property. The police came. Nobody's here. What can we do? The police left. He comes and returns the bicycle. This same white family called the police again. Why? The bicycle's back. You have your property. It's something that you were trying to even damn near give away, and the police came and they tased him over 13 times. Am I right?
Yeah.
And Jim Rogers died. And when he complained, when he was begging to be taken to a hospital, those police officers drove by the hospital and took him to jail, and he had cardiac arrest inside the car and died. This happened right here in this city. This wasn't, 6-8 months ago. And so this is why it's not a slogan for us. It's not something that we're doing to try to sound cool or radical. It's really about our survival as a community. And so if it's offensive to you, imagine how we feel when we see black and brown people continually murdered and killed by the police. How offensive is that?
Please welcome Jasiri X. Our next panelist, Councilman Thomas. As you introduce yourself, can you tell us the impact legislation has on interactions between police and community members, and even more so on mass incarceration?
Yes. Good evening, everybody. My name is Isaiah Thomas. I'm a city council member from the city of Philadelphia. So for those of you who don't know, Philadelphia is about 5 hours away from here. But outside, there you go, a little Philly love. Outside of that, though, Philadelphia has a unique makeup as it relates to our legislative branch of government. We have 10 district council members. We have 7 council members at large. 5 traditionally represent the majority party in Philadelphia, which are Democrats. And then we have 2 seats for the minority party. And I got to give a shout out to my sister, Kendra Brooks, in the back. She's one of my colleagues on city council. And she's one of the council members at large that actually represents the minority party, which is and she's the first working families party candidate ever elected, I believe, in the country for a municipal seat like city council. So we're trying to do great stuff. And I think part of why you see some of the energy that you see in the legislative branch of government, specifically in Philadelphia, is because we do recognize that legislation makes a huge difference as it relates to the issues that poor people and people of color face. But when we're talking about issues like mass incarceration and we're talking about issues involving criminal justice reform, legislation is a big part of it. And I'll give you 2 good examples. First and foremost, legislation is really something that's hurting us in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania with Act 111. If you're not familiar with Act 111, Act 111 is a state law that prohibits folks like me and some of my colleagues that are out here, and even some of my colleagues in Pittsburgh and in Allegheny County. We're very limited as it relates to what we can do involving police salaries. So when Jasir talks about the budget of the police department in the city of Philadelphia, over 90% of the police budget is salaries, right? And because Act 111 exists and because it's such a strong law, as the legislative branch of government, we're technically not allowed to be involved in any negotiations that pertains to the police contract. So at the end of the day, when you look at a law like that, it basically prohibits anybody that's not in the executive branch of government from being involved in any conversation, any dialogue, or anything legally that could impact the salaries of police departments as well as the accountability. And I think that's the one that's the most concerning to us all across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, because the story that I heard Jasir just say is really disturbing. But based on what I know about Act 111, it'll be very difficult to fire those officers that was involved in that situation and put them in a position where as though they will not be able to get their job back, not just in Pittsburgh and in Allegheny County, but anywhere in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So on the one hand, right, laws have put us in a position where they do a phenomenal job of protecting bad folks. On the other hand, laws can also put us in a position where they can liberate us from some of the conditions that we face as it relates to a lot of different areas. I'm excited to be here because a little later I'll get the opportunity to talk about one of the laws that I passed that I feel like has helped move us in that right direction. And so for us, one of the things that I abide by is the work of the elders. I believe in African-centered education. I come from an African-centered space. And one of the folks who I felt like was very instrumental to the work of black people was Bayard Rustin. And what Bayard Rustin talked about was the concept of transitioning from protest to politics. And so at the end of the day, we always need folks protesting. We always need advocacy. We always need people to help move the needle from the outside. But all of that can be much more effective when you have a collaborative effort with people from the outside as well as lawmakers. So thank you for allowing me to be here, and I look forward to continuing to talk about such important issues.
Please welcome Councilman Isaiah Thomas. And yes, as far as Jim Rogers is concerned, grateful to the newly elected mayor we have at Gainey. All 5 officers were fired, but we do have to deal with the FOP, who probably is going to go through arbitration to try to get certain individuals' jobs back, as the councilman mentioned. Next, I would like to introduce to you Ronna Davis-Moore. And Ronna, as you introduce yourself, can you give us your perspective on why incarcerating someone who uses drugs causes more harm than good?
Hello, my name is Ronna Davis-Moore. I am the founding director of Zakiah House Housing. At Zakiah House, we house people who are coming home from prison. We offer them a place to stay for as long as they need, and we offer case management. My perspective on incarceration, period, is we need resources. We need resources in our community. We need social workers instead of police to show up to scenes. Most of the time, there is a mental health issue, crisis, going on in that particular situation. And if we had a social worker there or a case manager who was able to help that participant, it might not turn into death for us, of what we know, and it might not turn into long-term incarceration, because we already know that we, as Black Americans, are getting sentenced way more than our white counterparts.
Welcome, Ronna Davis-Moore. And the next gift I brought to you is Salim Holbrook. Salim, for those who say abolition is not practical, would you please expound on how you see abolition, what it actually means, and the practicality of it happening tomorrow, if even at all?
Yeah, the first thing I'll say is that abolition is not going to come about through elections, legislation, or in budget cycles. Abolition in this country is going to come through social upheaval. That's how we're going to uproot these harmful institutions. Now, in terms of practical abolition, practical abolition is eroding the powers of the state and its ability to reach down and impact Black and brown communities every day. And what I mean by that is, we know that police powers are harmful in our communities. We know police interaction within our community is harmful, particularly in poor Black and brown communities that are suffering from trauma and poverty. So our work is to erode that power. One of the examples of, and I want to make this clear, that it's more often than not harm reduction, right? That's how we have to go about our work a lot of time. And one of the examples, and Councilmember Isaiah is going to talk about this himself, but is his drive and equity bill that takes police out of enforcing certain traffic violations in Philadelphia that were disproportionately targeting Black and brown people, right? Another example is some of the folks in the audience, Amnistad Law Project are advocating for non-police personnel to respond to mental health police calls in the community, right? That came about after the killing of Walter Wallace in Philadelphia, someone who was going through a mental breakdown. Police came and killed him. Similarities to what happened to Jim Rogers, right? So what we want to do is take police out of that interaction that has a higher rate of harm for our communities, particularly people with mental health disabilities. They have the highest rates of harm when it comes to police interactions. They are often not just assaulted and incarcerated, but they also have the highest rates of being killed, right? So we want to take police out of that. And the long game, though, definitely is shrinking the power of the carceral police state, and that requires us to engage in legislation. That requires us to contest within these systems, right, to roll back that power, to harm our communities. Because, listen, our communities are the most over-policed, over-incarcerated, and least safe in this country. So that's showing you that what we're doing now is not working, and we want to invert that and have our communities over-resourced, over-funded, because that's what's going to bring about more healthy communities.
And thank you. And my brother's always ready, but can you tell us a little bit about who you are?
So, my name is Robert Salim Holbrook. I'm the Executive Director of the Abolitionist Law Center.
Welcome, Salim Holbrook. So we know that these issues are national and international issues, but today, since we're sitting here in the city of Pittsburgh, we are going to focus on Allegheny County and the city of Pittsburgh as an example for this conversation. In 2019, the Gender Equity Commission put out a report. And Jasira, you talk about this report often, so I'm gonna come to you on this. Can you expound on what, in essence, the report found?
So 2019, and it was interesting because it was the mayor's office that commissioned this report. It was one of the first times in the country that they looked at not just race but gender. What they found was that Pittsburgh was the worst city in America for a black woman to live. When they broke this report down, they said a black woman could live anywhere else in the country and have a better quality of life than Pittsburgh. And so, of course, you know, two things happened. One, you know, like most of the response from black people was like, we already knew that. Like, we didn't need to report, like we already knew that. And then the second thing was, okay, now what are you gonna do about it? And one of the reasons why we saw a change in leadership in Pittsburgh is because although the former mayor commissioned the report and they put the report out, there was no plan on how to address this report to make the city of Pittsburgh more equity for black people in general and black women specifically. And it was that failure to address it is one of the reasons when in 2020 came and there was an opportunity to make a change that we were able to do that collectively as a city.
And, you know, this racism often plays out in the way that we're policed in our communities. As you can see, this stat says nearly 12% of Pittsburgh's black male population was arrested in 2020. So we're not talking about some decades ago, right? We're talking about just 2 years ago. A rate 6 times higher than for white males. Black women were arrested more than 4 times as often as white women. So last year, APA partnered with One Hood, and we convened a coalition to reimagine public safety. This year, we're working on implementation, and ALC has joined us as a co-convener. But this is the front of the report, front page of the report, which you can find online. It also should be in the plenary session, but if you need it, we can get it to you afterwards. But this is the front page of the report, you know, that we worked on. And there's 4 buckets that we faced, that we focused on when we're talking about reimagining public safety. And we're not going to do a deep dive into all 4 because we would be here all day, and they only gave us an hour. But what I did want to focus on is what I find to be maybe the most controversial or the most problematic for people to understand, and that's violence. And so what I wanted to quote, I want to read something that's in the report. Because when we're talking about violence, the first thing is knowing how to define it, right? Like when we hear violence, most people automatically, because mass media has done its job very well, think about gun violence. That's our go-to, right? And so how we define violence in the Reimagine Public Safety Report is this. Now, addressing violence as a public health issue is a tricky one. But here is the definition on how we defined it. To truly address the impact of violence in our communities, it is essential to understand that violence is far more than just crime. Rather, violence is an experience that limits or diminishes people's capacity to survive. Unemployment, inadequate housing, lack of access to mental health and medical care, subpar public educational systems, food insecurity, and racism are all violence. Violent crime within our communities is often a response to these forms of structural and systemic violence. We will not solve it without addressing these larger forms of violence plaguing black, brown, and poor white people in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County. That is why you have that printout on your chair, so you don't forget when you hear violence, what are all the things that you should be thinking of. And one of the things we highlighted was ending arrest for low-level crimes which often come from what we call broken windows policing, right? And Councilman Thomas gets this. This is why he was invited here today. Because when you're talking about broken windows policing, you can't not deal with legislation, because that's normally where it comes from. So Councilman Thomas, can you tell us about the work you've done when it comes to broken windows policing that's often done through traffic stops and stop and frisk?
Thank you. So in the city of Philadelphia, myself and some of my colleagues, we were able to pass legislation called driving equality. This bill was passed over a year ago. And basically, let me just explain the bill first. The bill basically treats several motor vehicle code violations that are similar to, let's say, a seatbelt and how we enforce a seatbelt violation. It moves them as it relates to enforcement from a primary means of enforcement, which is a traffic stop, to a secondary level of enforcement, which is up to the discretion of the police department. So first and foremost, be clear. People are going to try to tell you that we changed the motor vehicle code. We did not. The motor vehicle code is state law. We did not change the motor vehicle code. What we did, because Philadelphia is a city and a county, so we're responsible as a county for how we enforce motor vehicle code violations. We changed how we enforce minor traffic stops. In the city of Philadelphia, if you are driving without a seatbelt, right, this is before the law was passed, if you're driving around the city of Philadelphia without a seatbelt, you will not be pulled over for that. What happens is if you're speeding or if you run a stop sign and you also didn't have your seatbelt on, then you are ticketed for both, right? That stop sign you ran, as well as not having as well as not having your seatbelt on. So 7 motor vehicle code violations we looked at that are not a public safety hazard that we now classify on the same level as a seatbelt. First and foremost, if you have something dangling from the mirror, we already know stories of people being pulled over for car fresheners hanging from the mirror. That has now moved to a secondary level of enforcement. We also looked at minor damage to the bumper, right? That's not a public safety hazard. That has been moved to a secondary level of enforcement. Inspection stickers, those of us who get pulled over a lot, we already kind of knew that was a secondary level of enforcement because no one looks at your stickers and pulls you over because you can't see that. So that's something that you was already going to get a ticket for when you committed another motor vehicle code violation. Expired registration, we gave a 60-day grace period for that, specifically looking at the conditions that COVID created, as well as how much of a tool the data told us it was in the city of Philadelphia for people of color to be disproportionately pulled over. I feel like I'm missing 1 or 2.
Brake light?
Yeah, you know it better than me. One taillight being out in the back of your car, right? So if you have a taillight out in the back of your car, that no longer is a reason for police to pull you over because, again, most modern, newer cars, you have multiple lights in the back. So when you think about it from a concept perspective, these are things that none of them impact public safety. And let me tell you why we decided to do the bill. I mean, clearly we all know across the country that people of color are disproportionately pulled over compared to our white counterparts, but the data is extremely alarming. In the city of Philadelphia, black people are a little over 40% of the population of the entire city, but black people made up over 70% of the traffic stops. When you look at these traffic stops and when you look at a search after the traffic stop, in the city of Philadelphia, where our public defender's office examined the data, and at the time, our chief public defender was Kira Bradford Gray, who I got to give a shout out because she's sitting right over there. The public defender's office found that less than, I mean, the number is like 0.17, but when you say 0.17, I don't know, that doesn't ring a bell. But we'll say less than 1%, and that's generous, right? Because if I say less than 1%, it could be 0.9, 0.8, 0.7. It's actually 0.17% of the time. When someone was pulled over and their car was searched, did the police find some type of contraband and or a weapon, right? So we're not even talking about 1% of the time. We're talking about 0.17. So think about from the perspective of just somebody who's trying to be fiscally responsible, right? Yep. How much money are we wasting as a municipality, not just enforcing these minor motor vehicle code violations, but things that we know in the midst of all the crime. We're seeing record level of crime and gun violence in the city of Philadelphia. We've seen people pulled over in large numbers while the crime was going up. and we did not see and we didn't see crime being deterred.
Right.
The numbers actually got worse throughout the whole process. So at the end of the day, we feel like the legislation is really important because it's going to put a generation of young people in a position where hopefully their first interaction with with a police officer won't be because they've been pulled over. I was pulled over in the city of Philadelphia during the era of stop and frisk. We had a time when stop and frisk was a really popular tactic, not just in New York, but also in the city of Philadelphia. My generation, most of us, we were pulled over so many times that a lot of us lost count. I'm well over 20 times I've been pulled over by law enforcement. I've never been arrested, right? I've been roughed up. I've been put in the back of cars. And at the end of the day, right now, we have a shortage in police officers. So one would think that you have an entire generation of people who grew up with their initial interaction with law enforcement being unjustly pulled over, whether they were driving a vehicle or walking down the street, and then we look up and wonder why an entire generation of young people don't want to be police officers, right? And this is the last thing I'll say, a police officer in the city of Philadelphia starts off at around $80,000 a year. Why is it that somebody would rather have a Walmart job or a Target job than be a police officer? That's saying something about the lack of trust between communities of color and law enforcement, and it also says something about how ineffective we are as it relates to using police to deter crime, right? The way it's set up, police is supposed to not deter crime, but we've been brainwashed to believe that the best way to deter crime is with police officers.
Yeah,
I'm about to come to you. 1 second. I was going to
Okay.
tell you, please don't leave me. 'Cause I
No,
know you're
we
leaving.
have systematic poverty problem in the city of Philadelphia. Philadelphia is the poorest big city in the entire country. So at the end of the day, that's a reputation that we've had for a long time. When we look at our crime is seeing more young people involved, both as the culprit and as the victim. So you got to understand from an ideological perspective, how do we think that randomly trying to hit the lottery, because that's what I call pulling people over. You're basically just trying to hit the lottery, right? You don't know who this person is. You don't know what's going on. How do we think hitting the lottery is going to solve crimes? The last number that's extremely alarming was that our public defender's office found that in the neighborhoods where black people were less than 15% of the population, we were still well over 70% of the traffic stops. If you don't know Philadelphia, we're a very segregated city. We're a city of neighborhoods, but we're very segregated. So that means that black people are just passing through the community, getting stopped at an alarming rate. And the last stat, super last stat, is you're more likely to find contraband or a weapon on a white person when they're pulled over than a black person. So the logic behind all of it doesn't make sense. We're really proud of the legislation, and the data is already suggesting that not only are traffic stops down by 25%, but now when someone is pulled over, the likelihood of police finding a gun or some type of contraband has increased significantly because they're pulling people over for public safety hazards now, like speeding or running a stop sign or driving hazardously by swerving in and out of lanes or having probable cause because a crime has been committed. Who would have thought that that's how you should police neighborhoods?
I wanted to, just Sarah, did you want to make a quick point? Because I'm going to come back to you on this.
Yeah, I think a couple of things. Because I think it's interesting to me, particularly when you look at policing, because, you know, Councilman Thomas talked about how you see crime increasing or record crimes. This is after we've seen hundreds of millions of dollars given to police departments, right? We said defund the police, but it didn't actually happen. In most of these major cities, the police department's budgets has actually increased. But what's so weird about policing is when they do bad, they still get more money, right? And so the idea, like, you've got millions and millions of dollars, crime has still gone up. What sense does it make to continue to give even more millions into a system that's failing to secure us? One of the, you know, when you talked about the stats, this was the stat when it came to Pittsburgh. The city of Pittsburgh told us that it decriminalized marijuana as an arrest, right? In 2020, marijuana possession was over 40% of all drug charges by Pittsburgh police, and black people made up 85% of marijuana arrests in the city of Pittsburgh, right? Not only that, but because Pittsburgh decriminalized marijuana, but it's still illegal as a state charge, right? So the officer who pulls you over or arrests you for marijuana possession can give you a citation that would come from the city, or they can charge you with a state violation of the state for marijuana arrest. 90% of those who were arrested and got state charges were black people. And so this just shows you how, and I think that one of the things that I love about Brandy and her work of Alliance for Police Accountability is it really shows us how policing is systemically white supremacist and anti-black. It's built into the system. And even if you say we need more black police officers, the system still remains white supremacist and anti-black, even in the presence of more black people. And so we want to decenter police from our lives. To
Yes.
us, that means our survival.
Yes. Yes. I did just want to mention that, one of the, Councilman Thomas came here to help us pass the same legislation as far as the traffic stops are concerned. And our bill included brake lights, which is just a no-brainer to me because no one has eyes in the back of their car. And registration. And so right now we're working to amend that because we did a survey that, if I have time at the end of this, I'll bring up and show you all. We did a survey, a local survey here, to get our own data on the traffic stops and the people who were pulled over. And we found that people were also pulled over for turn signals, loud music, and tinted windows. And so we're trying to amend our legislation here to include those reasons.
And can I just say that we've had a lot of inquiries from all across the country as it relates to municipalities looking to introduce some form of driving equality. And I think what Brandy said is really important because at the end of the day, how it's catered to your community should be specific to your community. For us in Philadelphia, one of the biggest ones was expired registration. That was a very big one for us because we found that was the motor vehicle code violation that disproportionately impacted people of color compared to white counterparts, right? Like well over a significant number of people who were pulled over for expired registration were people of color compared to white counterparts. And let's be honest, we all make that mistake with forgetting to renew our car as it relates to the registration. But yet, for some reason in Philadelphia, that was a big one for us. So I do appreciate Brandy and the folks out here for not necessarily looking at the bill as it relates to the individual items on the motor vehicle stop, but more or less looking at the concept and the importance of the data reporting, because that's an important part as it relates to police being required to report data as it relates to who they stop, the demographic of that person, and why they stop them. Sorry, Brandy.
That's okay. And one of the other things that often comes up when we talk about addressing violence as a public health issue is this divisive tactic of police violence versus community violence, right? And especially in the black community. You hear people say, when they see people protesting police violence, oh, you all don't care about who was just killed over there. Oh, what happened? Oh, that was just my computer. Okay. You all, don't care about who was just killed in the community, which is not true. But it is something that is often brought up when we talk about this. And both of these things really come from the same foundational issue, which is this lack of investment in our communities. So Rana, being someone who has both lost a child to community violence and also embraces ending mass incarceration, can you speak to us about how you see this?
I can. So I mentioned earlier that Zakiah House house people coming from prison. Our mission is to reduce homelessness, addiction, and recidivism. My son Richard was killed in 2017 to gun violence. There is nothing good in jail, right? There's nothing good in jail. You go through the pain of losing a child, losing a sibling, losing a family member in that way, but being in social justice, working in the field that I work in, you have to realize that there was a link that was broken, right? So what I think is that when people commit crimes, any crime, there is a link that was broken from birth, let's say. I did something called the cycle of life, right? And so when I studied it, we talked about, at birth, you come in here with a clean slate, right? There's nothing going on, you're just a baby. But then through life, through process, something happens. For a white person, they're taught that they're to go to school, they're to go to the military, they're to go to do great things in life. An African-American child may not have that love, that support, that nurture. And maybe that's who killed my son, right? Maybe that kid didn't get the same hugs and love and, get the same goals planted out for him that Richard did, because Richard attended Cal U University. He was an engineer major. That same child didn't have that ability. I don't know, right? So what I will say is that when you go to prison, especially if you have a mental health issue, a drug and alcohol issue, you're not getting the resources that you really need there. It's a myth. So while society is telling us we're getting these groups and we're getting rehabilitated there, that happens on a personal level, inmate to inmate. Unbelievable, right? That happens on a level where maybe a person who was serving life in prison takes a younger person under their wing in prison and say, hey, you don't want to be here for the rest of your life. This is the steps that you need to take to get out of here and to stay out of here. So it's a myth that a victim wants someone to serve life in prison, get the electric chair. That is not true, especially that if you believe that there was a missing link somewhere in that person's life, especially if you know that an African-American child, let's say a black male, he was destined to lose from the beginning, depending on where he lived at and who raised him and how many people were in his household. Was his mother or father on drugs? So there's all types of systematic things in place to tell you that this person deserves this type of treatment or this system for African Americans. But that same approach is not for a white child. If a black child gets in trouble or something happens as far as drug use, they are written off to be a bad kid. If our white comrade has the same charges, has the same drug addiction, has the same homelessness status, they have a mental health issue.
Thank you so much, Ronna. And that is something that often comes up when we talk about this. Salim, did you want to add on? I heard you.
Actually, everything Rhonda said, eloquently said, is the truth. Prisons don't make us safer. People who change themselves in prison, people who change in prison change themselves not because of prison, but in spite of it. The mentorship that goes on in prison is something that prisoners do amongst themselves. The road to redemption, to atonement, to restorative justice, transformative justice that you're talking about. The Department of Corrections doesn't teach that, right? Prisoners teach that. Our allies in the street teach that. Our community teach that. And I think at the end, what it really comes down to is that we are our own liberators. It's going to be our community that is going to have to solve the problems of gun violence, intercommunal violence within our neighborhoods. And a really important point too is this, that because you made a very good point about how state violence is equated with intercommunal violence, and there's a difference there. There's a major difference. Our communities have high rates of violence because we have high rates of poverty, intergenerational poverty, discrimination, and racism that these communities have been trapped in, not for decades, but for hundreds of years. But, and this is really important, this is not unique to black people in America. If you look around the world, every community, every people or ethnic group that are trapped in cycles of poverty, in systematic discrimination and racism, they have high rates of intracommunal violence because the resources that are in their communities are so scarce and they're fighting for them. So that's a very important distinction. Even the term black-on-black violence is that black people, we're the only people that are harming each other. If you look, if people harm people that look like them, so white people harm people that look like them, other white people. Latinx people do it. Black people do it. And that's part of the the black experience in the United States, that we always have to be exceptional, or something has to be exceptional about us, either exceptionally good or exceptionally bad, right? As if we're the only people that have been trapped in intentional poverty and oppression because we're hurting ourselves. It's like, oh, you guys are the only one doing this. No, you'll find this all over the world. And that's a really important distinction between intracommunal violence and state violence. State violence is deliberate, systematic. It's set up that way. Policing, prisons, the carceral state is set up to harm our communities, not heal them, not help them.
So I did want to take the opportunity. I was going past slides because this is something that we actually are working on here. This is a report that we created. So I wanted people to be able to see it, but we're not going to go into each topic. I did just want to bring up one thing before I go into, if anyone has a question, about people who experience homelessness. I mean, you know, that it's just alarming to me, especially some of the things that are here in our local area, as far as resources that we lack. And so one of the things that I wanted to highlight that we were asking for when it came to people who were experiencing homelessness was this exclusionary requirement, such as being unhoused for a specific amount of time, or completely abstaining from alcohol or other intoxicants as a precursor to being able to be admitted to a shelter. Right? When a lot of people who are experiencing homelessness are also experiencing these other issues. Mm-hmm. And so to say that someone doesn't deserve shelter, right? We're going to leave you out in the cold because you can't pass a drug test. You know, it just doesn't make any sense. Right? And so these are some of the things and the barriers when we're talking about reimagining people who experience homelessness and the response to that we're trying to remove, because that's actually keeping people in the street. It's also actually harming people more. And it's just inhumane to say, you know, housing is a human right, to say you don't deserve a shelter because you are using drugs. And so one of the other things I wanted to bring up, and a lot of people touched on mental health, is narratives, right? And I wanted to just ask the panel, and Jasiri had to leave because he's introducing the mayor in the plenary session that I hope everyone is attending after this at 5:15. But I wanted to, and I was going to ask him this specific question as well, but I wanted us to talk about narratives because narrative plays a role in everything that we talked about today. If you noticed, I asked each panelist their perspective, right? And their expertise that they had in this area. What is your perspective? Because narrative matters, even with the data that was stated. You know, I want people to be very mindful of data. It's necessary, we need it, but it's nothing, and it doesn't tell the complete, it doesn't show a complete picture without the story to go along with it. Right? So you heard Councilman Thomas say that there was a majority, there's this disproportionality in black people who were being stopped, right? And so here in Allegheny County Jail, there's a disproportionality. In Allegheny County, I think we just realized earlier, it's like 12% of the population, black people are 12% of the population here in Allegheny County, but comprised of over 75% of the people incarcerated at Allegheny County Jail, right? And so people hear that data or hear that statistic and may conclude that, oh, black people are committing more crimes, right? So that can be a conclusion someone comes to. But without the story, you know, of over-policing, without the story of actually what is happening on the ground, you know, really what it tells us is that our communities are over-policed. You know, that there's more police in our neighborhoods, that we're stopped more, as we heard here on the panel. So, of course, if you're stopping people more, you have you know, a more probability to have higher numbers of people in those areas. And so I wanted to ask the panel, how important do you think narrative is when we're talking about mass incarceration and broken windows policing?
I mean, I'll go first. I'm excited to answer that question. I actually used to teach institutional racism, so like before this politics stuff, my favorite place and where I naturally belong is in the classroom and working with young people. And the narrative is extremely important because if the narrative is told in a way that's skewed, you will begin to believe that you're destined to fail. A lot of young people today, especially black children, believe they're gonna be dead by 25. So if I believe I'm gonna die by 25, I'm a senior citizen at 19. By 13 now, I'm in my mid-30s, which means that I need to live right now. So at the end of the day, the narrative is the foundation of everything, and what we try to do is make sure that our young people have an opportunity to be exposed to images and stories that's reflective of them, that represent people that look like them, that come from their neighborhood, so they can understand and they could be anything they want to be. The narrative, in my opinion, starts in the schools. So when we're talking about communities that lack investment, when we're talking about institutional oppression, it starts in the school. People who have money and have access to money, they have a choice, no matter what. They have a choice. People who live in poor communities are often forced to go to failing institutions that have no intention of improving their climate, culture, and curriculum to give those young people an opportunity to receive a phenomenal education and expose them to professional careers that could put them in a position to compete. So at the end of the day, the narrative to me starts in the schools. We hear a lot of dialogue right now about curriculum and what's being taught. We need to teach history from an accurate perspective. That's why I started by talking about the fact that I believe in Afrocentric education. That's a big part of my core and who I am. And then once we leave our schools, all we need to do is look at our communities around it. When we talk about our parks and recs, I said before, Philadelphia is a very segregated city. You could look at Philadelphia and see a rec center in North Philly where mostly black people live, and then go up to the Northeast and see a rec center up there, and it seems like you're living in two completely different cities. You could look at the issue of hit and runs. In the city of Philadelphia, we're seeing a record number of hit and runs, and a large percentage of it is because of lack of investment in infrastructure. So we can go in certain neighborhoods, like on 52nd Street, where it's majority black, and you'll see a long list of car accidents that's taking place there with no investment in infrastructure, right? That matters. And when we were talking earlier about government and legislation dealing with and addressing issues that specifically oppress people of color, well, elected officials decide how those dollars are dispersed. And at the end of the day, that's one of the things that I've been advocating for some time, but it's not the sexiest issue. Right? Infrastructure investment doesn't poll high. Nobody really wants to talk about that. But when you're in the midst of a hit and run epidemic in the city of Philadelphia, well, infrastructure investment matters big time. So at the end of the day, the narrative is the most important part. And it's imperative that we make sure that the next generation is being taught accurate information, data-driven information, because people are strategically trying to ensure that our children are erased as it relates to a certain amount of things that have happened in our history. There are certain things that people don't want our children to know. There are certain images that people don't want our children to see, and that's why you see this fight happening over curriculum and what's being taught in schools, because we know that the number one place that we can go to convene and meet our children is in academic institutions. So I'm going to stop right there because I'll bet the other panelists want to talk about this, but the narrative is the most important part. And when we talk about press, media, social media, and all the different ways that you can communicate a message right now, it's important that we use every mechanism possible to assure that our young people are taught accurate history, because that matters, and it matters a lot.
It does. Salim, Rana, you want to touch on, why the narrative is important when we're talking about poverty and mass incarceration?
I do. So at Zakiah House, we're constantly changing the narrative for our residents that come in, men and women. And Isaiah touched on the children. So we're working with the adults to change the narrative of what they were told when they were in prison, when they were in foster care, when they were in different situations where it was a negative experience for them. So we're trying to change that narrative that you are great, you are someone's mother, you are someone's aunt, you are someone's daughter, in order for them to carry on that information to their children that are in these Pittsburgh public schools, that are in private schools, wherever. So in order to change the narrative in what we do, we have to work with the adults to change their narrative of how they view themselves, which will help them help their children.
Definitely. Narrative precedes change. Before you make a change, you have to change the narrative. Even let's talk about negative narratives, or let's talk about false narratives like police make our community safer, right? That's something that we have to change. Police don't make our community safer. Police come in and pick up the aftermath of harm, of crime, of violence, of robbery or theft, but in terms of actually making our community safer, no. You know, police contain poverty, police contain that harm. But the other part of the narrative too is pushing back on those false narratives where we talk about how we need to have more resources to our communities. What Rana talked about earlier and what is our experience is the narrative of communities liberating themselves and helping themselves, even within the darkest places like prison, and then bringing those experiences back home into the community to help better the community, right? You don't often hear that narrative. The narrative I talked about earlier about like black-on-black violence, that is a false narrative, right? So in order for us to make any type of systematic change, we're first going to have to change the narrative that either upholds the status quo, right, or continues us following these cycles of failure, of self-harm, of community harm. So, you know, I'm not a teacher, but I do know that changing that narrative is the most important fight, because you could talk policy all you want. People in the community ain't trying to go into no deep policy dive with you, right? No. They're gonna wanna know, like, all right, how is this gonna change my life right now? Like, how's it gonna change my block? But when you could talk about changing the narrative on their block or in their lives, right? I'll give you, like Jaziri talked about defunding the police. I'll give you an example of a narrative. I remember when I was at a town hall and an older black woman came up to me and she said, look, baby, I believe I agreed on 9 out of 10 things you said. She said, but I don't agree with defunding the police. You know, she was like, you know, I had an incident, the police came, parked outside my house, you know, I felt safe. And I said, listen, I'm not gonna sit here and like, try and fault you for feeling that way. But I did go into a deep dive of what we were talking about when we were talking about defunding the police. And I started talking about how we needed to invest in community so that that friend of yours who had their door kicked in, we want to stop the door being kicked in. That's what we want to do. We don't want to be on the back end of that all the time. And then when I started talking to her about how back in the day, and don't get me wrong, our communities were never oases. But back in the day, your community protected you. The dudes on the corner protected our neighborhoods, right? And so when I started talking about that, she perked up because she said, yeah, I remember the 60s and 70s. I remember I could walk down my street and feel safe, not because of the police, but because the community looked out for each other, right? So that's a narrative we're trying to bring back. It's difficult because the war on drugs, the crack epidemic, destroyed that trust, right? Really destroyed our communities. I remember when our communities, you had people on the porch looking out for kids. It was unity in the community. The 80s, you know, between Reagan decimating the job industry and the crack cocaine, all that went out the window. But that's part of the narrative that we have to change and bring back. So the narrative battle, to me, is one of the most important battles because it precedes the change.
I hope you appreciate the gifts I brought you today. Do you have any questions? Anyone have a question for anyone on the panel?
Thank you all for everything you shared. Some of the pushback that I hear, including from people in the communities that we were talking about adding that investment to, the pushback I hear is like, it takes time for those resources to bear fruit, right? Like, it takes time for those educational programs to kick in, for those programs for our young people. If you are defunding the police, right, and redirecting resources, what do we do in the meantime? And while we're thinking about narrative, I'm curious how you respond to that sort of pushback about, you know, thinking to Brandy's question earlier about the practicality of abolition, right? How we talk to people about how we get there.
Can I answer that real quick?
Sure.
You're right. It takes time, right, for those changes. But how long have we been investing in a failed police state. We've been investing in this, in the war on drugs, the war on crime for 40 years. So that's part of explaining to people like, look, we're not getting out of this overnight, but I could tell you this, increasing the Philadelphia police budget to $1 billion is not going to make us any safer next year or 2 years from now. However, the data shows that when you invest in prevention, and there's other cities that done it, Minneapolis done it, Oakland has done it, Dallas has done it, sections of New York prior to this crackpot Eric Adams being up there have done it. When you invest in prevention, you're going to see incremental results. Listen, none of those are going to be a solution for what's going to happen tomorrow. That's the reality. And this is what I realized. When you go into the communities and you have these town halls and you speak to people and you're transparent and talk to people, like people aren't made of glass, right? When you explain to them like, there's no quick fix to this. What I realize is that if they see that what you're talking about is practical and logical, and you could show them some type of evidence-based solutions, they'll swallow that pill and be like, okay, we're going to be in this for the long haul. And I think like in America, we want the instant gratification for everything, right? And this is where it hurts our movement. But again, you have to go in there, you have to contest in those spaces, and you have to be honest. And you also have to tell them like, yo, we've been doing this for 40 years, and our communities are no safer. So can we at least try 3 years to see if it'll work?
That's true. We can't arrest our way out of this problem. We've been doing it for a while, and it hasn't happened. Right here, and then Kara.
I was just gonna push back on the feedback that you get sometimes and just say too that, that can end up being a false narrative in and of itself. And I'll just give an example for my city, San Diego, California. In I think it was 2021, they increased, which was the pushback from Defund, right? These all, it happened across the US. They increased police funding, and literally the following week, libraries started closing down and people were laid off their jobs instantaneously because that money was used to go to police. They pulled from libraries to get to the police. So when people say, oh, well, we want to try to prevention methods, but it's going to take time, it never takes time for the state to enact what they need to do to, flood money into oppressive systems, right, or regimes.
Right.
So we have to make sure we're pushing back against those kind of narratives as well.
And they defund education all the time. And nobody has a problem with that.
So as we talk about narrative justice, one of the things that I keep coming back to, as a public defender, of course, we keep arguing about the same thing. We understand that our cities are unsafe and that we need policing in certain areas. I mean, there are things that people won't get out of their heads. But how do we raise the values of allowing healthy communities to thrive? What that means economically, what's the impact of healthy communities on a city's economic opportunity, right? So if we're talking about narrative, we have to show if we are healthy in the more poorest communities where crime is down, people are actually contributing to the tax base, there are not a lot of things that we need governmental services to go to those communities. What is the correlation between that and a city increasing its viability? Those are the things that we have to start studying, like this right here. We're talking about advancing public safety, giving almost $1 billion in Philadelphia to police for the lowest, I guess, return on our investment that one could ever ask for. How is that increasing public safety? We're actually feeding into systems that are more destructive than constructive. And if we're always trying to advance the constructive, what does that mean in dollars and cents for communities and cities to thrive?
Right, and that is so true, and I just want to repeat a little because we're live streaming, and it's hard to hear the people who are in the audience, so I'm supposed to repeat each question, which I haven't done, so. But I do want to just highlight the point that was just made, and basically, it is, investing, and that's what we're talking about, is divesting and investing, right? And one of the questions that was brought up is, what do you say to people who say, well, if we defund the police, what are we going to do tomorrow? And defund the police doesn't actually mean right now we're down to $0, right? In the city of Pittsburgh right now, I just want to give an example. We have over 200 police officers up for retirement, right? What we said to our administration right here is that we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to really do true public safety, because policing is not public safety, and that's what we all have been taught. That is not public safety, and what we're seeing is that the communities who have the highest crime have the less investment, right? Data is actually showing us that. So we know that communities who seem to be the safest and that you want to go visit have the most investment. And so it's a no-brainer, and people know this. And so it's about looking at the systemic issues and getting to the root causes of things. We got to dig that thing up from the root if we really want to see things transform.
Can I just give you one piece of advice as well? Just arm yourself with information, right? So at the end of the day, one of the things that I said in the beginning was that over 90% of the police budget in the city of Philadelphia is salaries. Here's a alarming number for you. We have a law, in this Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that's called Pennsylvania Heart and Lung. And basically what that says is that if a police officer gets hurt on a job, right, they're allowed to take the amount of leave that they need and be paid a full-time salary. In the city of Philadelphia, we have 652 police officers who are on leave because of heart and lung, out of a police force of about 6,000. That's about 10%. That's abuse, right? So when you go to a neighborhood and you talk about police budgets, you have to be able to give them tangible examples of things that are happening with police budgets that have no impact on public safety. We are aware of the fraud that's taking place right now with police officers who are claiming heart and lung but are going on vacation. They're playing sports. They're working another job and starting another business, and that's an abuse of our money, right? We're also aware of situations where lawsuits take place. One of the things that we did with our driving equality bill was we looked at the amount of lawsuits that we have within the city of Philadelphia and how much we spend every year on payouts that started with a negative interaction with law enforcement. That cost the city of Philadelphia anywhere from $10 to $30 million a year that we're spending on lawsuits that started with a negative interaction between law enforcement and a constituent. So I would say know that budget, know that budget, know that budget. So when you go to have that conversation and people start talking about public safety, you could say, well, look, I can identify $30 million that we could take away right now and not one police officer would be fired. All we have to do is do things different. If we didn't have some of the laws that we had in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, whether it's heart and lung laws or Act 111, we would not spend $1 billion on policing. Again, a large part of that is salaries that are paid to police officers who are also on what we call a no testify list in the city of Philadelphia. We have dozens of officers who are on that list, which basically means they can't do police work, because if you can't go to court and testify about what took place, how can you make sure that you're responding to incidents once something has already happened? So my piece of advice, whenever you go to have a conversation about this stuff, know the budget, know how the money is being spent, and you could easily identify dollars that are being wasted.
One more question? I seen somebody's hand. Okay, that's great, because I only had time. Okay, one more question.
Oh, yeah, I remember, sorry. If like, that's all great for like the system and stuff, but on a daily basis, if, for example, like I see a black person getting pulled over, what is the appropriate response for me to do that? Because I've had, some people say that like they should try to make sure there's people around so that nothing happens. And I've had some people say that it's like disrespectful to do that. And so I'm just curious, like on a daily basis, like what can individuals do to kind of try to slowly get that, like erode that system's power?
Does somebody want to take that question?
I would say that it depends on the circumstance, right? So if it's 3:30 in the afternoon, I'm being pulled over, it's a well-lit street, it's already humiliating being pulled over. Sometimes in the city of Philadelphia, they'll bring 2 or 3 cars, and you didn't even do nothing, and you're really scared. You don't know exactly how this situation is going to end because you're wondering why so many police are there if all I did was, at best run a traffic light. If it's at nighttime, I do think that it's a good idea to record, to have people there, to have eyes and ears on the situation, because I think that puts the person in a little bit of ease, because the anxiety is a little bit higher when it happens at night, because you feel like it can end any way with nobody watching. Now, let's be honest, right? We all seen George Floyd, that was broad daylight. right? So I don't want to act like that because it's daytime that nothing can happen. But I'm speaking from personal experience right now, right? And when I've been pulled over at nighttime with not a lot of people around, that make me much more anxious than being pulled over at a high traffic intersection in the middle of the day when anybody can see anything. So that would be my advice, not Councilman Thomas, but constituent Thomas, based on lived experiences.
And what Alliance for Police Accountability would say, every time you see a stop, pull out your camera, pull out your phone, begin to record, because you never know. It only takes a millisecond for something to escalate. Jim Brown, what happened to him, what Jasiri brought up, it was broad daylight as well. I did just want to say thank you all for coming. I did want to end us on a note of summation, right? The whole thing about reimagining public safety is really centering our humanity. It's really getting back to people, right? People end up homeless. People use drugs. We are people. We are human beings, and we do not deserve to be locked up for these situations. And the idea that people say that we can't solve these issues, that we don't have the money to solve these issues, we just need to reapportion where we are putting this money at. We need to invest in what we know works. We know education works. We know good jobs with livable wages work. We know people having Medicare works. And so we put the money as quick as we take it out of the community back into the community, we won't have these issues. And the reason why we say this is systemic is because those in power know what I just said is true, which is why there is divestment in these communities, which is why they are neglected and not invested in, is because they know that this will be the result. When we have private prisons like we have private hotels, right, you have supply, you need demand. Right? And so if you have a private prison, you have to make money off of that, right? And at the end of the day, how am I going to make sure that there are bodies in this jail that I own so I can profit and make my money? Because if nobody comes to my business, which is a jail, then I don't make money, right? And so how can I do that? I do that by taking all my billions of dollars and supporting legislative efforts that help continue and sustain those systemic issues. And so this is why we are fighting back the same way. We are fighting back focusing on systemic causes, systemic issues, focusing on root causes, and making sure that we are centering people in their humanity and mobilizing them to make these changes. So if you want to do this back home, please feel free to look us up. I had another slide, but of course I turned it off, sorry. If you need the information, you can see me at the end of this. Thank you so much for coming out.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.